So yes, there is very much an emergence around this need to reconnect with nature. And we need to go slightly beyond that and say, how do we build that into a governance system and a coordination and incentive system? So part of what we're attempting with the corporate link up to rural communities is to say, here's an incentive system. So we're saying that there will be some kind of prize. This will be audited by an auditing firm, and there will be a national awards thing. That's an incentive system that is tied directly to what is happening on the land, stewarded by people living locally, where corporates get some kind of benefit from it, which is much more real than the current ESG checkbox exercise that they're doing. So that's an early example of a slightly different incentive system. But it's those experiments that need to be scaled significantly with lots of different ideas being brought to the table and experimented on. And let's make some mistakes, but we're heading in the right direction, which is ultimately an incentive mechanism, a governance mechanism that is directly related to the health of the more than human species with which we share this planet.
Michael, good morning and welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you? And what for us is quite a lovely sunny summer morning.
Well, hello. Very good to meet you, Amanda, and congratulations on your book launch. I know that's been keeping you very busy, so we'll keep this session as to the point as we possibly can. As to where I am, I'm in a little mountain village 90 minutes outside of Cape Town, South Africa. It was a long journey that got me here, both intellectually, mentally, physically, emotionally, and hopefully we'll touch on that. It's winter here now currently, so a little bit of rain and a lot of wind, but very good to be here with you.
That sounds amazing. And definitely, I would love to uncover how you got there. My real experience of working with South Africans has been on World of Warcraft, where the South African hunters were extremely good at what they did. But we had to work around their load shedding, which was they would just switch off, but with warning, the power. And it would be like, we're having load shedding for 2 hours at 10 o'clock your time, I'm sorry. And there would be no power. And I was, first of all, impressed that they did that and that they did that without riots. I imagine any government who tried to do this in the UK would actually end up being shut down by the end of the week. First of all, I'm guessing you're not about to have load shedding because you get warning. Just for very briefly and for my own interest, how does the politics of that work? How is it that an entire nation goes, yes, it's okay, you can just shut off the power for a couple of hours at a given time because we're just taking too much?
It's been a very extensive marketing campaign to get everybody on board. And you may be asking the wrong person, because I'm an extreme skeptic about what the real reasons are behind load shedding. The good news, though, is that we've had power up and running now for almost 3 months. Of course, there's been many pundits that have questioned, well, what does that have to do with the election? Obviously, the currently ruling party, the African National Congress, were keeping the lights on so that we wouldn't forget, it would be out of mind about how bad they'd been at maintaining the power system. So who knows how long that's going to continue for. That in itself is a huge, lengthy conversation, which we could have another podcast on. But for the moment, we have had power for the last 3 months. Touch wood. Mm. Great question. Thank you. So, a resilience strategist goes a little beyond a sustainability advisor or expert. And in the corporate world, there's many, many, many of them. In my view, they are simply tick box exercise specialists. There's a lot of greenwashing going on. And for me, the underlying principle that we should all be addressing is resilience, because that's what nature does. Nature is constantly resilient, no matter what pressures are thrown at them, whether it be climate, whether it be economics, whether it be, whatever the issue is. Nature always bounces back, and it's my view that that's what we should be doing as an intelligent and conscious human species. But if I may just backtrack a second and give a little bit of my worldview, which I think helps frame the rest of the conversation. You okay with that? Great.
Absolutely. Also, tell us
So,
how you got to this, how this worldview was shaped. I think that would be really interesting.
okay, so my life journey, but the very snapshot version of it, because I've been very fortunate to have a very full life. I started off in a corporate career, technology. I helped launch mobile telephony in South Africa, which was in 94, 30 years ago. We had to have the whole system up and running before the first all race election. So it was an incredibly stressful time and a significant time in the nation's history, the elections. And I'll come back to the elections because that's relevant now as well. Through sheer fortune, that particular role went very well. I was headhunted, ended up in Sydney, Australia, and then from there lived in 16 cities on 6 different continents, all of them except the Antarctic, with a huge amount of travel in between. So I was incredibly fortunate, able to see the world at somebody else's expense. And then when my final assignment ended in Taipei, Taiwan, I then went backpacking with my then girlfriend through Asia, saw a completely different side of the world as somebody living there, so not so much as a tourist. Um, there was an incident that happened in Asia, which maybe we can touch on, but that led to a significant shift where I ended up, after a 2 year sabbatical, then working in the systemic change space. And that was advising and helping organizations, think tanks, university research departments that are interested in answering the question, this system that causes the individual challenges in society, is there anything that can be done about the system rather than working on the symptoms? And so that was an incredible experience, spent 12 years in that space. When COVID happened, though, I walked away completely burnt out because there's a huge amount of talk, talk, talk. And of course, the system doesn't change. So learned a lot of things, but I've now shifted into a much more practical, hands-on thing, saying what lessons can we take from that space, and then I'll shift into what we're doing in the valley here. But I'll give you just a chance to check in. Have I lost
Thank
you?
you.
Is
No,
that
you
time?
haven't lost me. I am intrigued at every level of that. Tell us what the incident was, because what shapes people, I think those stories are what's really going to change the world, is the things that we pay attention to, the things that touch our hearts, the things that take our standard trajectory of business as usual and shift us onto a new track. Tell us about that.
So maybe before I tell you about the incident itself, I'll tell you about years that end in four. And it seems to me a pattern throughout my life that every year that ends in a four, something significant happens. So the first was
Okay.
1994, which was, from a career perspective, that was a highlight for me. But secondly, we had the first all race elections in South Africa, which was a fairly significant moment. Again, I'm going to
Huge.
come back to the elections because this year is 2024. We've just had a major election, but I'd like to let's do the first part of this conversation first. The second significant event was 2004, which is this event that happened on a beach in Thailand. And I'll give you the shortened version. Very simply, had an out of body experience while lying on a beach in Thailand. The first is that it was completely unexpected. I certainly wasn't going on any kind of spiritual quest. So it came completely out of the blue, and there was no substance involved. So it wasn't
That
as
was
if
the
I'd
obvious
taken something.
question, wasn't it? Right. Okay.
So that was a profound experience. In the experience itself, which I can elaborate on if necessary,
Definitely.
but at the same time, I had an incredibly crystal clear vision of some kind of future society, but at every level and with a huge amount of data, just a download of information, most of which made no sense at the time. And so what I ended up doing is, for 3 days without sleep, I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. As memories of the vision came back, I would make a handwritten recording in a little journal, which I carried around for many years. Again, not knowing what to do with it because most of the information made no sense. But because I go through it twice a year, I've been able to sense into things that are emerging in the zeitgeist around the world from very different, unrelated projects and initiatives that are happening. But each of those events align very significantly with something that appeared in that vision. I've since met many people, and this is an important point to make, that this is not a particularly special experience. I believe a lot of people experience it, but because it's so overwhelming, and because your real life, in air quotes, drags you back into whatever it is you're currently doing, you forget about the vision. And I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that if we collectively took more or placed more importance on these kind of events, we possibly wouldn't even be having these kind of conversations now. The world would be in a very different state.
So I have questions arising from this. We may end up spending the entire hour talking about your vision, but this feels really important from a shamanic perspective because I'm 100% that what you've just said is true. So this happened 20 years ago. We were going to talk about you, I assume, walking this vision into being. Did it feel at the time, does it feel now, and the answers to these may be separate, that the vision was a foretelling of a possible future that you would then have agency to bring into being?
That's a deep and nuanced question. How do we take it? So let me first stress again that most of the vision made no sense at the time. And having walked the journey now for 20 years, I think that's because when a vision like this is given to us, and many people experience the same thing, you try and interpret the vision within your current level of consciousness, your current understanding of whatever your worldview is. And so I think our challenge is to expand, develop, build on, widen our worldview with a sense to understanding more of what that vision is. And so there have been various incidents that have happened in my life since then that have significantly shifted my perspective. But what's been great about having the vision is that it becomes a North Star, because it's very easy to get waylaid and detracted off on, down various rabbit holes and get involved in stuff. But so it's been very helpful to me to have that North Star, and it always is a little bit of a check. Am I still heading roughly in the right direction? Like the analogy of the sailing boat, we know that we change directions, but you're heading in generally the same direction. So to answer your question, was this an unfolding of something that is to come? I think it was more a taste of a potentiality. And to unpack that a little bit further, I like the way Clare Graves explained this in a 1974 essay, where he spoke about three possible outcomes. Firstly, he was framing his conversation as a momentous leap, that humanity is poised to make a momentous leap, but it's not guaranteed. And there are three possible outcomes. The first is termination. So basically, civil society just completely collapses and goes back into the dark ages, whatever your interpretation of that is. The second is a techno-feudalism outcome, where it's the equivalent of 1994, lots of surveillance, lots of totalitarianism, that kind of outcome. And then the third is transcendence. And transcendence is an evolutionarily coherent next step. This is what nature does when it reaches a point of being under pressure, but it's not guaranteed. And so if we think about mass extinctions, those are moments where those particular species that went extinct weren't able to make the momentous leap, and that ended up in termination. So the vision certainly is of a potentiality, but it's not a guaranteed. And so that brings us on to the conversation around the commons, which I don't think we'll dive into just yet. But I believe that our challenge is to, from a human coordination perspective, how do we collectively make that momentous leap? All the other bits, in my view, all the hectic conversations going around, pick your topic, those to me are incidental. Our test as the human species now is how quickly we can come together and coordinate our activities. There's unbelievable initiatives happening, and they're not coordinated. But let me stop there and take a quick breath.
Brilliant. Yes, coordinating our activities absolutely strikes me as crucial. Let's go back to park that for a second, because that's exactly where I want to go, because that clearly is where you have gone. Of the three, termination is obvious and transcendence is obvious. It strikes me that techno-feudalism will be a self-limiting role or a self-limiting step, because by physical limits being what they are, techno-feudalism seems to me, in its Trumpian Bannonite iteration, takes no account of the fact that we are in the middle of a meta-crisis. and therefore is not going to try to address it, and that techno-feudalism itself is not going to take off. It might for a short while. I guess this is the reason I'm not more scared by Bannon's vision of a 10,000-year Reich, is that it's going to hit the biophysical buffers. Do you have thoughts on that?
Very much so. But before I unpack the thoughts, perhaps I could explain my worldview, because it does, I think, effectively frame the rest of the conversation.
Go for it.
So firstly, I look at very long cycles of history, because I don't believe that we can look at, the tiny little, if you look at the impact that the human has had on the planet, the period of time in which the impact has been made is very short. So it helps us to expand that a little bit. So one that I'm particularly interested in is the cycle of the rise and fall of civilizations. Now, there's been a huge body of study around that, and the patterns that emerge from it is that there are basically 7 phases that every civilization goes through, and every civilization lasts between 200 and 300 years. I don't think we'll go into unpacking the details of that, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's sufficient to know that these cycles happen, and that they happen over and over again with incredible regularity, and we don't seem to learn from previous civilizations.
Can I ask a couple of questions? Because I'm thinking about Egypt and Rome, and they seem to me to last thousands of years. And even the rise and fall of Greece lasted a lot longer than 200 or 300. So we're looking at meta. That would be a meta civilization, and you're looking at civilizations within, say, the Roman Empire and then the Roman Republic?
Yes, I'm looking at the shorter periods when you had a very specific set of leaders with a very specific ideology. And then that ideology invariably ends. And I'm giving an average. So it's not, there's not a hard and fast rule. And even using an average is not a worthwhile exercise.
Okay. But it's 10 to 15 human generations,
that
roughly.
7 phases. They all go through these different 7 phases. And there have been historians and authors that have spent their entire lives documenting each of these civilizations. So this is a meta study of each of those cycles.
So I have another question, largely because I tend to work in millennium scales, and those feel as if they are iterations within what I would call the trauma culture, and that this is perhaps how the trauma culture functions, and that within our longer history of humanity and within what Francis Weller called the initiation cultures, the indigenous cultures, there are presumably other cycles. I would imagine, and I may be projecting, that indigenous cultures don't have these 200 to 300 year flips because they're not working under the tensions of the trauma culture. Does that sound as if it would fit?
I use slightly different languaging, but the outcome is exactly as you've described it. So firstly, over the past 5,000 years, there have been various rise and falls of civilizations, but each of them have repeated the same essential framework. And it's basically a class-based civilization, which starts off with a division of labor at the very lowest level. And then as you extrapolate that civilization, you reach the point where you have the 1%. The 1% eventually hollow out the middle of that society. And then eventually this society can't hold the weight of the 1%, and eventually the whole thing collapses. Which leads me on to the second part of the cycles. So I've had to create a term to help us understand, or to help me get my head around what each of these civilizations basically build. And the word that I've used is an interstructure, which is a portmanteau between interrelationship, interdependence, and infrastructure. So if you think about our current civilization, we've got a fair number of organizations. We've got a financial system, an economic system, an education system, a health system. All of those things together I refer to as an interstructure. And each of the prior civilizations have built similar interstructures. Now, the commonality of each of those civilizations over the past 5,000 years is that they've all been class-based interstructures. It's all a complex mix of social systems that support the slow evolution over the 200, 300, 400 years of that civilization's lifetime. In comparison to that are the indigenous societies, and the longest surviving one is the Khoisan that originated here in Southern Africa. Now, they built their societies as a values-based society. And in a values-based society, without any external forces, that civilization carries on indefinitely. So, they were living very abundantly on the land here. And let's park that for a moment, because I'd like to come back to another point around these larger um, cycles and developments in human consciousness. And here I can refer to a book called Emerging World by Roger Briggs. So for a long period of time, I immersed myself in the studies of consciousness and how consciousness develops and what consciousness is. Roger's book was incredibly helpful to show historically how we've been through 4 different phase shifts in the evolution of human consciousness. But the point of the 5,000-year conversation of the class-based civilizations that we've just been through now is that it appears that we're reaching the end of that very larger cycle as well. And so the momentous leap is the potential to come up with governance systems, coordination systems that operate at a very different level of consciousness to what we have now. So not only is our globalist, capitalist, neoliberal system experiment, not only is that coming to an end, but we're also coming to the final phases of a materialist consciousness. And so the opportunity that lies ahead of us is, are we able to navigate a momentous leap to a completely different way of being on the planet? And that excites me.
Yes, yes. And does that feel as if that was integral to your vision? Now that you're looking back on your vision with 20 years of experience, can you make more
Yeah.
sense of it?
So maybe I can give one example. The resounding answer to your question is yes, but giving a little bit of an example may help. So the experience, the vision happened in 2004. The Bitcoin white paper came out 5 years later, but in that vision was very much a story of a currency that we created ourselves. And I must stress that it made absolutely no sense to me, because Bitcoin didn't exist. All we had was national currencies. When that, oh, there we go. Yes, great. Um, so when that particular event happened, that was a little a weak signal of, okay, there is something emerging that's way beyond any one of us, any group of us, that is pointing towards this idea of us figuring out. Now, ultimately, I think that's going to lead to, because another worthwhile book is Debt, the First 5,000 Years
Yes,
by David
David
Graeber,
Graeber.
who also talks about the cycles of currencies that basically swing between debt-based economies and credit-based economies. So I think part of this evolutionary leap is going to be a leap towards mutual credit. And some of it will be enabled by the thinking that was enabled by Bitcoin. It doesn't mean that we necessarily are going to go full on down the crypto route, but the development of Bitcoin and others enabled us to develop our thinking along the lines of, we no longer need nationally issued currencies. We don't need a debt-based currency, but we don't know what it means to use a mutual credit system. So we've got to figure out all of that, and there's many initiatives. We can touch on some of them, experimenting in that direction. But this is the bit that we've got to coordinate and bring together into some meaningful and understandable coordination system. That's the big challenge ahead of us.
Yes. So let's just unpick this a moment, because I'm really curious to know where your vision has gone, because I have had similar visions, I think, possibly. But the big question that comes for me, and this is something Graeber didn't quite touch on, and I was desperate to talk to him, and then he died. It seems to me that fiat currencies are always imposed by violence, either actual or implicit violence. And that if we're going to move to a way of exchanging, accounting for, and storing value, which is what a currency is, that works, that is aligned towards flourishing, it has to not be based on violence. And we don't quite know how to do that. But you've already spoken about the indigenous cultures, the initiation cultures, the cultures that could survive in perpetuity, where mutual exchange was just integral to how they worked. Value was always flowing amongst and between people, and they had incredibly sophisticated social structures. We move on to Graeber's next book with David Wengrow of The Dawn of Everything, of how those structures worked so that value was not only flowed well, but it was seen to flow well. Do you have a sense of how we could do that? And before we go to anything, I need to tell the people who are only listening and not watching this that when Michael said, "Oh yes, there we go," I just held up Vitalik Buterin's book Proof of Stake, which I have just bought to read, which was his vision behind the founding of Ethereum, which is a blockchain-based currency that is not based on the disaster that is Bitcoin. And it seems to me that there are now iterations, the second or third generation of Ethereum, that are really looking at how we could do this. I think maybe let's not get lost in the weeds of exactly how that works. But I want to know, have you got a sense of how we could account for, store, and exchange value in a way that is cooperative and not destructive and isn't based on the implicit sense of we own this currency, we being the hierarchy, and if you try to create a version of it yourself, we will at the moment imprison you, but previously kill you and enslave your children?
Again, a very deep question to unpack. And rather than us going down the economics or the currency rabbit hole of this interstructural conversation, I'd like to first mention that it's not only fiat-based currencies that lead to violence, it's the entire class-based interstructure that leads to violence. So we can even go down the economic system that causes us to think that we are different, that by the time we finished our education, there are differences in us. And that in itself leads to violence when extrapolated. There's a huge amount of detail we could go into here. The reason I'm mentioning it is because it's been helpful to me to keep in mind that it's the entire interstructure that needs to change. It's not only how your currency is issued, it's how we bring up children, it's how we feed ourselves, it's how we treat the land in the way that it produces the things that keep us alive on the planet. So the minute you start unpacking each one of these individual things, you end up, because all of them have massive complexities, and it's very often easy to lose sight of actually it's the entire infrastructure that needs to be radically changed. Now, fortunately, there are individuals working on each aspect of this very large, very systemically challenging issue, which again brings me back to my point. We now have solutions in each of those spaces. Do I know the exact answer around currency? No. I can point you to a whole range of people who have incredibly interesting sounding solutions. Our challenge now is to bring them together and to erect this giant circus tent of a values-based infrastructure that takes into account all of the developments that have happened around the world. So I'm afraid I'm not giving an easy answer, but I'm giving you a
But this is
sense of
so
how
cool.
challenging the issue is that we face as a species.
Yes, and you're right. We need total systemic change, and you're absolutely right. I can't tell you how happy I am to realize that somebody else is probably streets ahead of me on this, because I've been talking to people about total systemic change for probably the last couple of years, and generally there's that kind of rabbit in the headlights look of, oh, we don't even understand what you're saying, and you're already there, and you've been there for 20 years. So let's cut you loose, Michael. What is most important that we understand? Let's take as read that listeners to this podcast understand that we need what I would call total systemic change and what you're calling change of the infrastructure. How do we do it? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Where are you on this path? Just cut you loose and go with whatever feels most important to say.
That is the million-dollar question. There's no simple answer to this. So first, let's maybe ground the conversation a little bit and refer to the elections that have just happened in South Africa, the elections that are coming up in the UK and then the US.
And
this
France,
year, which is a year that ends in 4, seems to be a significant year as far as elections are concerned. Now, my views on firstly, the outcome of the South African elections is that they've ended up going for a government of national unity. And I put that in air quotes because South Africa as a nation is so diverse that the concept of national unity for me just doesn't gel right. It's not what nature does. Nature celebrates diversity. It doesn't celebrate unity. There's unity in diversity, but the way this political system has been structured does not celebrate that diversity in any way, shape, or form. And so I'll go as far as saying on this podcast that the path that South Africa appears to have chosen, and it's going to have to take 10 years to play out before we know whether this will be true or not. The path that South Africa appears to have chosen is the techno-feudal path of the three that we've spoken about currently. Now, that is, if we as South African citizenry continue to rely on the government as the sole source of how things are done in the nation. And I think that will, if we continue down that route, it'll end up to our detriment. So what I'm trying to do, one, I'm in the process of launching a book that is aimed at South African corporates. And the idea there is to get them inspired to become involved with rural communities rather than doing their ESG greenwashing, because more and more people are just now widely accepting that all of the ESG and any environmental issues done by corporates is pure and utter greenwashing. Yeah. And fortunately, there are sufficient business leaders who no longer want to continue that journey and do want to make, as responsible citizens of society, they do want to do something meaningful. And so the thinking here is to create, and this is building on Joe Brewer's work, who I'm sure you're familiar with, is a national awards system for the restoration of river basins, where basically a corporate sponsors, in air quotes, a particular river basin, and they work with communities who live along that river to revitalize not only the river, it's not just picking plastic out of the river, but the entire hydrological cycle that is impacted by the river. And the only reason I'm doing this is as a test to see, can we establish some form of coordination that is outside of the state and outside of the invisible hand of the market. Those are the two most significant forces that are coordinating human activity at the moment. Now, this is obviously inspired by the vision. Whether it's going to work, whether there's any kind of guarantee or not, no. So it's an attempt, it's an experiment, and we'll see where it goes.
And in other podcasts, we've discussed the concept of personhood for rivers, mountains, trees, areas of land as a legal entity. And it seems to me that while stepping outside of the government, stepping outside of the predatory capital model, having a legal structure that protects that which you are investing in from the predations of the state and predatory capital is quite important. Is that part of the plan? Or would it even work?
Maybe I can take it a little further than that. So if you think about rivers as personhood and mountains, and so any natural resource, I don't like that word at all, but any natural entity, if we treat it as a person, when you think about health of a person, there are various measurements, and when you go for your annual checkup, the doctor will have certain things that he checks for you. Now, from a societal measurement point of view, we've got one metric and one metric only, which is GDP. So there's a lot of incredible work happening in the space of genuine progress indicators. So once we've established a river with a legal entity and as a person, now you need to attach the progress indicators to that entity, so that you have something very specific for you to track. It's pointless giving it legal personhood and then
you don't also
not really doing anything about it.
Yes,
right.
Dark Matter Labs are doing a lot of work on this. I don't know if you're talking to them, but they're working really hard in this area. So
there's a few. So Dark Matter is probably leading the conversation, but there's quite a few where, and the interesting bit, and this is where I think Dark Matter is heading towards, is how do you tokenize those progress indicators? So in parallel to what we've just discussed here, we're exploring land trusts, where you essentially remove land from the ownership model, tokenize it so that it now becomes a stewardship model. Now, I haven't read Vitalik Buterin's book, but I'm aware of some of his thinking, and I think that's the direction in which he's moving as well. The point being is that the things we're discussing on this podcast is an emergence from the zeitgeist. This is not any one person's ideas. Yeah. What we're doing is collating and bringing together we're building the jigsaw puzzle. All the pieces are on the table already, but what hasn't happened yet is the building of the jigsaw puzzle. And as we build it, it becomes clearer and clearer.
Yes. And it seems to me that the techno-feudalists are very organized.
Yep.
They have a common goal and they know how they're going to achieve it. And within those of us who are seeing the emergence of something different, that organization and the agreement on common values does not seem to be happening. And partly we're all zoomed out, partly we don't like the idea of all subsuming to any kind of hierarchical system because we're inherently anti-hierarchical. Are you seeing the mycelial networks beginning to build where people are becoming aware of each other in ways this podcast is trying to foster? Are you seeing that happening on the ground?
Let's touch on the techno-feudals on their level of coordination first. So the various parties playing in that space. Remember that their sole existence is to defend the class-based interstructure that they've built over many decades, potentially even hundreds of years. And so the level of coordination required to accomplish their goal is significant. So we're up against a fairly massive machine that, in my view, can't and shouldn't be stopped. We should allow it to run its natural progression. And you can only feel comfortable in saying this sort of thing when you're familiar with the cycle of civilizations. So in my view, it's absolutely guaranteed that the techno-feudal approach will collapse at some point. And our role should be to shorten the time span between when that happens and when the next system emerges. So the emergence of a new system also is a natural outcoming of this cycle of civilization. So we must keep that in mind, not get too hung up about all the bad things that are going on in the techno-feudal space, of which there is plenty. So we focus instead of what emerges. And your mention of the mycelial network, absolutely that's happening. There's plenty of these conversations going on, plenty of ideas being shared. And the bit that hasn't yet been tackled is the level of coordination that gets us to at least a parity with the organization of the techno-feudal system currently. So that is a natural outcome of what will come next. All we're trying to do in the Valley is, make some mistakes so that others can learn from it and hopefully build on that.
And in your vision, was that level of coordination already extant in the future that you were seeing?
So either that wasn't included in the vision or I didn't pay enough attention to it, because it's the most challenging piece and there's no simple answer to this. So what I saw in the vision was the outcome with no clear indication as to how to get there. And I think
get this through
the people involved in the mycelial network that you've just mentioned, those are the ones that are busy figuring out how to do this. And to the extent that we can get across that it's now more an issue of coordination than any of the individual symptoms that very well-intentioned groups are working on, albeit in silos and on their own currently.
Gosh, you are speaking my language. Every interview that I've done since the book launched, I've been talking about we need to build this coordination network. So you came to me saying we were going to talk about the rise of the collaborative commons. So it seems to me that we're there now in this conversation. We're at that point of how best can we step along the path? What can we do to encourage this? And exactly as you said, to speed or to narrow the distance between the fall of the existing system and the rise of a new one, such that when I was at Schumacher, we used to talk about trying to create the soft landing. And then we realised that what we were actually trying to do is take a Boeing 747 and turn it into a helicopter in mid-flight without killing anybody on board, which is quite hard. And that feels to me a more appropriate metaphor now, particularly that Boeing has decided to design its aircraft so that they actually fall out of the sky. How do we redesign the aircraft while in flight such that hopefully billions of people don't die in the process as we emerge into something new? Where are you taking this? What are you doing now? What does it mean to be a resilience strategist?
So maybe a little bit of background thinking to this before we dive into the weeds of that very tricky answer. So the first is to look at cities as one potential structure of something that represents the interstructure that is currently collapsing. The reason I say that is because it's my belief and my belief only. I've got no evidence to back this up, but that it would be very difficult to do the work that you've just spoken about in a concentrated area represented by a city that is absolutely committed to the continuation of the infrastructure, which we can see, some can see, is currently collapsing. So it's harsh, but for me, it's a cleaner, more clinical method of, for now, excluding cities. That doesn't mean that cities are completely, there's no hope for cities. I don't believe that at all. But we need smaller scale experiments, place based, and there's many of them emerging all over. And you'll notice that most of them are not in cities. The vast majority of them are out in rural areas. And I think the reason that's easier to start there is because there's less of an impact of the current infrastructure in these rural communities. Now, there's a slight disadvantage there in that many of those stuck in poverty, I put that in air quotes, in rural areas, are aspiring to be in the cities. And so there's first a little bit of a reset of the way we think about what it is that we're striving for. What is the human purpose? Why are we here? What is the outcome of this species? Those are challenging conversations. And you mentioned the word trauma earlier. There's trauma at so many different levels, all within this infrastructure. And that trauma needs to be addressed even before we can consider how do we build this thing. So I think the phase that we're in now, there's still a fair amount of, and you may have experienced this yourself, a fair amount of chest beating where somebody is coming to the table saying, I have the solution. I've been working on this all my life, and here's this amazing thing. The challenge with many of those solutions is that they've not yet been implemented.
Yep.
So what I believe is we're moving into a phase now where these various solutions are attempting to be implemented in smaller sized communities. And I think that would be anywhere between maybe 10,000 to 50,000 people. That would sort of be the sweet spot. And there's no scientific research to back that up at all. I can only see half the book. What is that type?
So now I'm holding up for Michael Plurality by Glenn Vile and Audrey Tang, because it seems to me you were talking about Taipei, and which is really interesting because I was just invited to a conference at Taipei that I can't go to, but you maybe can. Because Audrey did what you're talking about at scale in Taiwan and fended off the Chinese assault on their general elections in January, which I think is a really, really interesting thing to watch. And as of 3 weeks ago, she's no longer the digital minister of Taiwan, and she's joined, she's now in a foundation whose name I can't remember, but it's looking at how do we create social media that bring people together instead of harvesting our attention and hijacking our limbic systems by tribalizing us and pushing us to the margins. And that strikes me as someone who gets exactly what you're saying and was able to do this at a national scale and needed to do it at a national scale in order to keep her nation on balance. So I think that there is some really, really interesting stuff happening, because the good thing about the technical part of the techno-feudalism is that you and I would never meet in real life, and we're having a conversation in real time. We can have conversations at distance and at scale that were never possible before. And of course, so can the techno-feudalists, but that seems to me part of the mycelial emergence is the fact that ideas can be shared in real time over really wide spaces. So it doesn't have to be just the rural areas. I live in a nation where everyone in the cities is trying to get out to the rural areas because the cities are not that much fun. But some of the mayors of some of the cities are doing spectacularly interesting stuff under the radar of the overarching establishment. So it kind of depends where you are in the world. But I hear what you're saying about most cities are wedded to the old system, and we need to have these little focal points of emergence. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just think,
if I may build on the work that, is it Audrey or Aubrey? She's been on my radar.
Audrey, Audrey.
Right. Firstly, I'm not undermining the work that she's done. I know that she's done an incredible job there. What makes it a little bit easier, and that doesn't mean that it is easy, but the fact that Taiwan is an island and it's a relatively contained ecosystem. There's still a fair number, I forget the number of what the population of Taiwan is.
20 million.
Right. But it's contained. An island is a perfect place to do these kind of experiments. In the valley that we're in, we're fairly isolated. So we're 35 kilometers away from the nearest freeway that goes between Cape Town and the next cities. We don't get a huge amount of through traffic. There are no banks here. Our form of
Sounds
traffic
glorious.
jam is cows wandering across the street. So it's those kind of locations where you're somewhat insulated by the current infrastructure that makes the ability to perform these kind of experiments slightly easier. And I'd love to read the book that you've just recommended, because I know she's done incredible work there.
Okay, but let's narrow down on what you're talking about. I listened to a really interesting podcast a while ago where there was an area in South Africa, I believe it was South Africa, where they'd created a local currency which was doing really well until people tried to bribe the police with it. At which point the people who'd created it were arrested. And in the end they were let go because people were saying, no, it's not a currency. I get one of these tokens and it allows me to swap it for a chicken with my neighbour. That's not currency. And the government backed away. What are you explicitly trying to do you think, that's heading us towards the emergence into something different?
We're still a long way away from coming up with any kind of solution, but there are many conversations going on. So firstly, the incident that you're referring to, I think may have been called a place called Oranje, which was one of the first separatist places in South Africa, and they have established their own currency. They've established it on something in South Africa. It's known as a stokvel, which is a community contributed pool of resources. And the reason it's important that in South Africa we do that kind of structure is because that structure is recognized by the Reserve Bank. So yes, they've issued their own currency, but it is still recognized by the Reserve Bank. Now, what one needs to do is make sure that it's a mutual credit-based currency, which if we're talking about the same currency, this one is not. It's still a debt-based system. So I'm incredibly inspired by the work of Will Ruddick in Kenya, Grassroots Economics, who is currently exploring the idea of commitment pooling. So each of us have an ability to commit to tasks that can be performed within the community. That can either be things that the whole community benefits from, like fixing potholes in the road, or it can be something an individual family benefits from, like looking after your children while you're away at work. But each of us have an ability to commit to something, and you essentially come to a central basket and put that commitment in, and you then exchange. I could come and take something that you can commit to, and you take something that I can't meet, but that you need, but somebody else does. So it's taking the concept of a mutual credit system quite a bit further, and beautifully is based on how many of the indigenous cultures used to operate. So it's a case of unlearning and then relearning and saying, well, how can we apply some of these more technologically advanced systems like crypto so that we can keep a track of it? And so I'm following his work very closely. We've had quite a few conversations. There's something emerging there, which I think is going to be the basis on which we build something here. And in South Africa, we've got this concept of a stokvel, which is recognized by the national government, which to me is important, because if you're doing something that isn't recognized by the government, at some point you're going to be taken down. And what's the point of that?
Right. So can we look at this a bit more deeply? Because my understanding of initiation cultures, indigenous cultures, is that the flows are very complex. And there's the word now, I think, is in the West beginning to lose its impact because it's used so often, but Ubuntu, I am because we are. And I listened once to a fascinating podcast with a white Western woman who'd ended up almost by accident married into a tribal society, and she was very interesting because she was a Western academic and a mother of children within the tribal unit, and she was able to act as an interpreter across really big cultural boundaries.
Wow.
And the thing that she pointed out was, if I am hungry, everybody is hungry. If I have food, Everybody has food. There isn't the separation. There isn't, exactly as you were saying, the class-based hierarchies. They don't exist. The person who has a lot of cows is not rich as a headman. He's the person that we trust to look after the cows because we all need the cows. It's a whole different mindset. And you look at him and go, oh, headman rich, lots of cows, and you're completely misunderstanding the way that the entire cultural setup works.
Yep.
How do we shift our mindsets? And it seems to me South Africa, it's not a long time. It's not 2,000 years since most of your culture engaged in this. It's probably a couple of generations for some of them. But how do we move the people who are not used to it? Sorry about the cat. It's just easier to let him do his thing. How do we move to a place where the interweaving, where it's not, I have a token because you looked after my kid, and then I can give you a token, and it'll, I don't know, give me some potatoes, and it's still very transactional. How do we move away from the transactionality to the flow that seems to me inherent in a genuinely mutually cooperative system?
Again, a very deep question that you're asking. I love the way you frame the question. The simple answer for me, and there's many layers to unpack here, would be that we shift from a notion of ownership, which is very much the primary driver of the current interstructure. You have to own your house, you have to own these various status symbols, to a model of stewardship. So you mentioned the owner of the cows, and he has many heads of cattle. He's not the owner of the cows. He is the steward of those cows. And at the same time, he's the steward of the land on which he rotates those cows around. And there's an unwritten agreement with the society that the way he's treating the cows and the land and everything else that he touches around that is part of his calling. It's not so much about a value exchange. In the Western world, we have to have this, how are you going to monetize this? And what's the value of those cows that he's looking after? What's the value of the land that he's regenerating? And I'm not sure that that's an easy shift. I'm not sure that it's even going to happen in one generation. But the point of these experiments, place-based experiments, is that we're inching towards what will come next. So for context, I'm a solo dad to a daughter who will turn 21 years old in 2035. And I know that she will be the person who carries on the work that we start here. So my the best 21st birthday gift that I can think of giving to her is the basis of the kind of conversations we're having here, knowing that she must step into a leadership role and make it really happen. We're not going to see that in our lifetime. The changes are so significant that we have to operate in a multi-generational phase. But the simple answer, just to come back, a difference between ownership and stewardship, I think, is the basis of where this development will come from.
Right. Yes. Because I'm also reading an amazing book called Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who is Brazilian, half indigenous and half German. And obviously the internal conflicts of that are huge. But her indigenous grandfather said to her that the damage of colonization was not the taking of the land and the killing of the people. Obviously they were huge, but they were epiphenomena of the original damage, which was the belief that we are separable.
Yep.
Not even just the belief that we're separate, the belief that separation can happen. And that to heal and to step forward into whatever it is we are becoming, we need to rediscover our connectedness. And it seems to me that even stewardship of the land is a step beyond. But if we get to genuine connectedness, I am a part of that land. The land is a part of me. I am listening to the land and asking what it needs me to do. And I am the part that has, insofar as I know, conscious agency for myself. Every other part might have conscious agency for itself. That depends how shamanic we're going to get. But I have conscious agency for myself, and my role then is to ask of the entire interbecoming complexity, emergent web, what do you need me to do in this moment? And do it. In the trust that the web knows what it's doing. And I may die in that moment. But that's okay, because I've done what I needed to do for the web, and death is just a step on the path. Yep. And we've, somewhere in our trauma, however long ago it was, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, we've told ourselves that we are separate when we're not. Are you seeing around you, first of all, does that land in a way that makes sense to you? And Are you seeing around you a sense of coming back to the connectedness to the all that is that I feel is essential?
Does it land? Absolutely. And one of the abilities that we need to develop, you mentioned listening to the land, listening to other more than human species that are communicating at incredible levels. You mentioned your cat earlier. My cat often wanders across here. I learned recently that cats do not meow to each other, they only meow to humans. And the reason they do that is because they've figured out a way of communicating across species. There's no need for them to do it when they're just among a bunch of cats. We as a human species haven't figured out how to do that the opposite way. There are rare exceptions who can speak to animals. My daughter is one of them. Um, but until we get that, we can't even have the bigger conversations until this extent of interconnectedness manifests itself in our ability to deeply hear what is being told to us. Because the minute we can do that, we solve so many challenges. I'll be a little controversial and say that there is no such thing as a climate crisis, provided we listen to what the land is telling us and we respond to what the land needs. We will very quickly avert any kind of climate disaster to the extent that we're willing to do that. But instead, we're coming up with techno-feudal solutions and trying to suck CO2 out of the air. That is a
Yeah.
massive disaster waiting
Or
to happen.
geoengineering, where we're going to turn the whole
Yes,
sky white, and
right.
nobody's bothered to ask what wavelengths every living thing needs that may
Yes.
not then get through. It's just inviting the biggest set of catastrophes one can possibly imagine because of that separating thinking. That
Your
was taking me to
question
somewhere else. Go
concluded
on.
with, do I see much of this emerging? And again, it comes back to a coordination issue. So yes, there is very much an emergence around this need to reconnect with nature. And we need to go slightly beyond that and say, how do we build that into a governance system and a coordination and incentive system? So part of what we're attempting with the corporate link up to rural communities is to say, here's an incentive system. So we're saying that there will be some kind of prize. This will be audited by an auditing firm, and there will be a national awards thing. That's an incentive system that is tied directly to what is happening on the land, stewarded by people living locally, where corporates get some kind of benefit from it, which is much more real than the current ESG checkbox exercise that they're doing. So that's an early example of a slightly different incentive system. But it's those experiments that need to be scaled significantly with lots of different ideas being brought to the table and experimented on. And let's make some mistakes, but we're heading in the right direction, which is ultimately an incentive mechanism, a governance mechanism that is directly related to the health of the more than human species with which we share this planet.
Oh, that's so good to hear, because that's what I have been missing. Because it seems to me, I run courses on how can we actually begin to connect to the web of life. And, it takes 20 minutes, half an hour a day, but then it has to become a practice. And distressingly few people are prepared to commit that amount of time per day. And I think, really, honestly, guys, you can't free up half an hour, genuinely. And some can, clearly. And I think there are tipping points to that. And I think the more they do it, the more that we'll be able to do it. Because once one begins to do it, it's completely addictive. I feel more alive now than I have ever felt.
Right.
Simply by trying to practice what I'm trying to teach, because, hey, that would be a good thing. But what I was missing was that the jump to getting people who are never going to spend half an hour a day endeavouring to connect to the all that is, or at least not visibly so. How do we give them something that matters to them that isn't part of the debt-based, violence-based economy? So are you aiming to shift to a point where these kudos points, whatever you are going to call them, have enough value that as the old system crumbles and money becomes tighter, they will still be honoured? Because that strikes me, I don't know how long you think we've got, but it strikes me it's collapsing in real time and it's accelerating the speed of collapse. And I love the idea that you're looking forward to 2035. I suspect the world that your 21-year-old daughter will step into in 2035 will not look remotely like our world looks like.
Correct.
And won't be functioning like our world looks like. So how do we create resilience in these systems
Mhm.
that will continue when the people who currently only extract want to extract more faster and are more desperate to do so.
Mm. So I think first let's acknowledge that we are in the middle of collapse. There's no question, there's no way that we can reverse the economic challenges that our various economic systems face, the ecological challenges. So that's a reasonable starting point. And the ability to look deep into that abyss and recognize it and be willing to work within that space is a skill that fortunately many more people are developing, but it's still sorely lacking. There is still a sense that we can stop something from happening. And, from a pure cycle of history perspective, you can't. From an ecological perspective, it takes 40 to 50 years before any large scale activity that you do now impacts the ecological changes. A lot of that has to do with the heating in the ocean and all the rest. Basically, we can't stop anything overnight. And once you can wrap your head around that, become comfortable with it, and operate more effectively within the space of collapse, then you start coming up with some solutions. I see you have a question before we
I
continue.
do have a question, because I think that's true if we're looking at collapse as carbon based. But if we're looking at, for instance, glyphosate impact or nitrate runoff from the rivers, or we've broken 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, so right on the edge of breaking the 7th of ocean acidification, and we could stop PFAS, the polyfluorinated alkylated substances, the forever chemicals. We could stop glyphosate. We could stop the nitrates. We could stop a lot of the industrial agriculture output tomorrow. Monsanto would go out of business. Oh dear, how sad. That would be a political choice that would have immediate impact, I think. I noticed in lockdown, when everybody wasn't driving, the insect numbers and the bird numbers just in that 1 year went up and then went straight back down again. There are things that we could do that would make an immediate ecological impact, I think, if the political will were there to do them. Is that a narrative that you are seeing anywhere other than within the bounds of this podcast?
No, is the short answer. And the reason for that is because the incentive mechanism to keep the current infrastructure going is far stronger than any logical reason that we can bring up to stop, for example, plastics in the ocean or glyphosate. And you may occasionally, by some extreme stroke of luck in one or two nations, be able to accomplish something that stops a little bit of damage, but that's a symptom. It's the entire infrastructure that needs the fundamental reshape and reorganization. And that's a career limiting move. If, as a senior official in any form of government, you're going to start having those conversations, no leader of any country is going to start having that conversation. And I put that out as a challenge, hoping to be proven wrong. But the indications are that that's
Iceland,
not going to happen.
I think, might happen. They've just elected a very pro climate aware prime minister, but Iceland's quite small, and as you pointed out before, small island states have something of an advantage.
Yeah. And you must remember that every nation operates within a larger machine. And so even leaders of countries nowadays are not really able to make sovereign decisions. They have to fit in with this larger infrastructure. That's another rabbit hole that we could go down. But there was a question that you were asking, and I've just gone blank as to what it was, so we may have to come back to it.
I probably have too. I was asking about whether stopping the glyphosate, stopping the obvious, particularly industrial agriculture, but I think you answered it, because it was, we're in a hyper complex system, and pulling one lever might make some difference, but basically the overarching system is what has to stop. I'd be really interested in going down any of the rabbit holes we've met, but I'm also, you said a ways back something to the effect of that the awareness of our need to connect to the web of life is only just beginning to filter up through the mycelial network of those of us who want complex life forms to continue. And yet, way back 30 years ago, you had a vision on a beach in Thailand, and there are other people who have had similar visions who have been similarly touched.
Yep.
And that strikes me as, in my shamanic world, this is the web of life endeavoring to give us agency, endeavoring to break through the miasma and the walking nightmare of the existing infrastructure.
Yep.
And I wonder, are you hearing from, or have you been contacted by other people who have had similar visions, such that there is a network building of visionaries Is that a thing?
So, in this space, which let's loosely call it the regenerative space, I think it's needing another label, but I think you know what I mean by that. There's a lot of really interesting things emerging, and yet they're still not connected. So just to again stress that and I mean, there are networks of networks being built. There's incredible work being done. GaiaNet is one that comes off the top of my head, but there's numerous others. Um, and yes, they're bringing people together, and yet we still haven't figured out a system that involve for me it's the incentive mechanism. So what causes that healthy living system to do some incredible stuff? What is the incentive mechanism that makes it happen? There's a lot of discussion in this space that it's so difficult to unlock capital from the existing infrastructure. People have tried high net worth individuals, they've tried family offices, they've tried the corporate space as far as ESG is concerned, and there's a resistance to unlock the necessary capital to make it happen. And maybe that in itself is a lesson, that incentive mechanism is the bit that is causing us pain in the first place and trauma. And so we must create our own incentive mechanism. Now, I'm not clever enough to know what that means, but so if we refer to weak signals, there are weak signals all over the place emerging that point towards that's what's coming next. And so I think our role is to make those weak signals more visible, to amplify them. Um, a phrase that I like using is the evolutionary impulse. You used a different phrase, and I've just gone blank on what it is now. But essentially, there's this innate capacity for a living system to constantly strive for higher levels of complexity. And that's the space that we're in now. We can see that existing forms of governance, no matter what ruling party, no matter which political party comes into power, the system itself is now the glass ceiling against which our natural desire to have more complex ways of interbecoming, which is also from Dark Matter Labs. So that's the bit that we need to figure out. It's not only the coming together, but the figuring out once we're together, what are we going to do now? And specifically this idea of an incentive mechanism of some sort. I don't know enough of what the options are, and I don't think there's a single answer anyway, but we're heading in that direction is what it feels like to me.
Okay, because listening to Schmachtenberger particularly, that the concept of the system of perverse incentives and how that's
Yep,
more likely to head us into the techno-feudalism. One of the things that Audrey Tang did, and that was 2014, was the Sunflower Revolution. Yes, another year that ends in a 4, was to fork the government. So gov.tw was the Taiwanese government website, and they created gov0, which is g0v.tw, and they mirrored what the government was doing, but they did it totally transparently.
Wow.
And within a very short length of time, Audrey was invited into the government and to reverse mentor one of the leading people in the government, and then to become digital minister. So it was done in good faith, as far as I can tell. I think if that were done here, it would be, we invite you into the government in order to make sure you never get to say anything ever again. However, it seems to me, and certainly this is what I wrote in Any Human Power, and I'm working on the sequel if I ever get any time, is that forking governance could become a thing. That the government, we have already established, you said it's obvious that the people who get into government are not the people who are going to make things change for the better. They are there because they won't make things change for the better. The system is designed to maintain the system. But there is nothing to stop us creating a new system in parallel and giving that our time and our energy and watching how it works. And we can still pay lip service to the existing system until it's obviously hollow and can be left to collapse. And then if they want to sit on the benches at Westminster just over 2 sword lengths apart and scream at each other as if they were 5-year-olds in primary school, they're very welcome. But we don't have to pay them any attention. Right. We can give our time and attention to a new media system, to a new way of sharing value, to a new way of structuring deliberative democracy such that it's actually democratic and not just the best democracy that money can buy, which is what we've got in our country, and I suspect that's what you've got in yours, even though it may dress itself up slightly differently, because that's the way the system works. That is the infrastructure. So This is a question I'm thinking in real time, and very possibly you're thinking in real time. Is there a way we can enhance the likelihood of forking governments to become something that is whatever the word we're going to have that isn't greenwashed, that means what regenerative currently means? We definitely need a new word because it's been hijacked in this country, and regenerative farming is now glyphosate and Mintil, which is not regenerative. And I don't care how often we need to repeat that. That's not
Yeah.
regenerative. That's a hijack. But we, what can we do to promote the forking of governance in a way that works?
So the concept of forking, I believe, is the key, such that you have parallel systems running next to each other, sometimes complementing, sometimes going in a completely different direction. And to bring in the notion that it doesn't always have to be government that forks. It could be, and this is what we were attempting in South Africa, that you have the corporate sector being the key player running in parallel to government. And the reason I say that is because the corporate sector is then enabling the people sector, the civil society sector, to go and do some things without waiting for any kind of mandate from government. So the principle, I think, and every country will be different, and you'd have to have people in each nation thinking this one through. But essentially, you're probably familiar with the Three Horizons framework by Bill Sharp.
But
So you've got
explain it for
Horizon.
people who aren't. Yes.
Okay, so you've got a Horizon 1, which is business as usual, and that's clearly in the process of ending. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with Horizon 1. It served its purpose fantastically for a great, if you think about ever since the Industrial Revolution, much of the progress that we've accomplished would not have happened if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution. But at some point, the efficacy of that system or that invention eventually runs out. Then you have Horizon 3, which is the desired future state to which you want to get to. This is a very futuristic, much better situation than you're in currently. And then there's a gap between H1 and H3, which is filled by H2, which is the temporary bridge between one system that's ending and the other that's emerging. So the fork in government, or the parallel systems that you're creating, are the H2 systems, and the forked entity is the one that is focusing longer term on the Horizon 3 outcome, but you have to come up with interim solutions that enables a bridge between the two. So at the moment, that's happening in smaller grassroots initiatives, but again, it's not at the scale that we need. So we've been using the term countries and nations and so on. Even that is a limiting structure, because if we think of Joe Brewer's concept, which is river basins and so on, uh, national boundaries don't take those river basins into account. So it's a completely fictitious creation. So what we're attempting to do in South Africa, in our tiny little valley, is if we get it right here, and it touches on the commercial farming, because if we can show, we're completely surrounded by commercial farming. But if we can show a model that works very effectively just within our valley, and then we don't go to the Monsantos of the world, we go to the individual farmers and say, look at how we've reduced our input costs. Look at how much healthier the soil is, so that you don't need to worry about throwing all this gunk into the soil. And slowly we're doing that parallel emergence of something that comes from the bottom. But it has to be demonstrated. There's been enough talk and enough, good ideas and theory thrown around. We think it's now time to actually demonstrate it, and then see if you can accomplish this emergence from the bottom up at a national, forgive me using the word scale. Because once we can show it happening throughout other pockets within South Africa, it then becomes Southern Africa, and then the entire African continent. So that's my dream. Whether we're going to get there in my lifetime, I don't know, but it will happen.
Yeah. And you're right, we have to start somewhere. And so you're starting here, and that we also need to then tell the stories. Because we're endeavoring to do exactly what you're doing here. I have a vision of this whole valley, exactly that being a regenerative valley. But I also know somebody a few villages away who moved in, set up a regenerative farm, and so we had a drought, by UK standards a few years ago, 2017, and her land was completely green because she used holistic plant grazing. And the local farmers didn't come and ask, how did you do that? They're basically at the level of, you're obviously a witch. They haven't burned her at the stake yet, but they were. It's you're obviously doing really. We have no desire to do anything that you've done because you came in and you did this, and it's all wrong. And
Yep.
so, getting the narratives right, so that this becomes a collaborative, collective, non-threatening thing that doesn't assault people at a limbic level, so that they feel they're being talked down to or challenged or proselytized or whatever it is that triggers the "we're definitely not going to do whatever you've just done," is as important as being the exemplar, I think. And
Mhm.
that's a whole other skill set, but it still really needs to happen. I think this is something that Audrey Tang managed really well in Taiwan, was shaping what people saw so that they understood the ethos of what was happening right from the beginning of the Sunflower Revolution,
Mhm.
taking in the Ethernet cables so that the whole country could see that the students were peaceful, so that when the police came in and had all the narrative of these are terrorists, we need to destroy them, the people had already seen that that was not the case, and that the police were the ones bringing in the violence, and that
Right.
we have policing by consent, we have governance by consent still.
Mhm.
Techno-feudalism might make that tighter, but at the moment that remains the case, and we can still do it. This is so exciting, Michael. I'm so in awe of where your thinking has taken you, and that it all started with a vision, and that the fact that these visions are sent and are given are happening,
Yep.
and that then you had the capacity to step into the process of that is what gives me great hope that we can still turn the bus of our civilization away from the edge of the cliff of total biophysical breakdown, or the cliff of termination, I suppose we would say. Is there anything? We're running out of time. I feel there are several other podcasts we could have, and I'm very happy to have them, although I am currently booked into January, so not immediately. But
Mhm.
is there anything that you feel you wanted to say that we haven't got to? The space is yours. Use it as you would like.
Just to build on what you were saying just prior to this, is the power of narrative. I think that's another thing that's missing in our space. And again, a shout out to Joe Brewer, who's been incredible telling his story on LinkedIn, and the number of people he reaches just in telling that story, and the change that is effected as a result of just telling our stories. We're not good
Yes.
enough about it. And for me personally, one of the reasons for that is because we think that change is happening too slowly. But the more we celebrate any small breakthrough that happens and make it public, the more we're going to shift this, change the direction that the ship is heading in. And so, my final thought is, when you think that something small has happened, it's a lot bigger than what you anticipate, and maybe just allow those ripples to ripple out. Um, and we're in a good time. There's plenty to be upset about. I do want to stress that, depending on the framework the lens through which you look, we are incredibly lucky to be alive at this time, to be witnesses of what is waiting to emerge. As we know, giving birth is, a painful experience, but that beauty that bursts forth when the birthing happens, we are standing at that moment, witnessing it as it happens. And that to me is an incredible, incredible privilege.
Yes. And not just witnessing, it's given to us to be a part of it. And
Right.
that just strikes me as, yes, it's a heart bursting privilege, but it's so extraordinary. We
Mm-hmm.
are here. We are the people, and now is the time.
Right.
And everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we are, can
Mm-hmm.
be that butterfly wing that creates the typhoon on the other side of the planet. And we don't
Absolutely.
know the complexity, but we can just be what we need to be. So,
Mm-hmm.
sharing stories, sharing this podcast, and all of the stories that emerge is the best that we can do. Michael, this has been an astonishing conversation. I'm so grateful that you got in touch. This has been just brilliant. And I have no doubt we will come back and have other conversations. Thank you so much for coming on to the
Thank you for
Accidental Past
holding
podcast.
space and for your beautiful work. Thank you, Manda.
Thank you.